Okay, I wanted to start this lesson tonight with a reference from chapter 5 of our study beforehand. And as I described before, skeptics look under every word and sentence to prove Daniel didn't write Daniel and it happened much later than 500 BC. They're always looking for a mistake or what they perceive as a mistake, and they're going to attack you and say you don't know what you're talking about. So it's important that we learn how to recognize when they're making a mistake, asking you to believe that you're wrong. Because this is apologetics, and you shouldn't have to do it, but we're going to meet people that will argue with you every chance they get, and so we need to be able to answer them back. The last verse in chapter 5 says that Darius the Mede received the kingdom, and he was about 62 years old. What we have to get straight right off the bat is Cyrus the Great defeated Babylon. Darius became king, but Cyrus the Great is the one that defeated Babylon. Cyrus came up with the plan to dig a trench to reroute the Euphrates River, which left the water line to go down so that he could go under the gate and go in and take over Babylon. Otherwise, Babylon was undefeatable. It couldn't be defeated. But he got this idea, I think from God, to dig the river out and let the water level fall so he could take it. But when Cyrus the Great took Babylon, he appointed Darius, the king of Babylon, because he had other things to do. Cyrus the Great was an emperor, and he made him king of one province. So that's the deal. So it's going to say Darius was the king of Babylon, when in fact Cyrus the Great was the actual conqueror of Babylon. And they're going to say, well, because Daniel said that Darius was the king, that's not right. So they're going to argue with you all the time. But we'll see that the Bible is very plain, and it's just like what I just said. Cyrus defeated Babylon, but made Darius the king. Okay? He gave the kingship of Babylon to a man called Darius and made him a vassal king. Now, a vassal king is just an appointed person. So let's say, for instance, that I was the head honcho of America, and I went and took over, say, Hawaii or something, and I appointed Mark as the king of Hawaii. But he would still answer to me, even though he would be the top guy in Hawaii. He would run everything about Hawaii. He could hire and fire and arrest and do whatever he needed to do, but he would still answer to me. So a vassal is what these emperors did all the time, is they would take over a province and then get a trusted person and appoint them to be king of the area. And they reported back to the emperor with tax money and products and business, armies. In other words, if I needed 15,000 guys in my army, he would send me 15,000 guys from Babylon. Even though they're not fighting for Babylon, they're going to be fighting for Cyrus the Great. So it's kind of like an appointee. Skeptics jumped on Darius received the kingdom. The first words is Darius received the kingdom. So the skeptics jumped on that first thing as if he actually conquered it and became king in his own appointment. When I first started the study of Daniel, I had no idea that so many people considered Daniel made up and full of wives' tales. You need to be prepared to answer these people when they come at you. Unless you are a history buff or an archaeologist, most people won't be able to answer these challenges, but rest assured there are reasonable answers to all these challenges. There happen to be several Cyruses and several Dariuses over the decades in Persian history. This is a problem when they have a common name. Darius actually means the holder of the scepter. So whoever was the holder of the scepter was called Darius. So you're going to have Darius first, second, third, fourth, fifth, you know. You're going to see this all throughout history, and it's confusing unless you keep up with it. Darius was a title, and his real name was Gobryas in Greek, or Gubaru, or Ugbaru in Persian. The general that entered Babylon first in 539 BC For me, Darius just means holder of the scepter. The trick for us is to be careful when we read Darius in Scripture. It might not be the same person spoken of in Daniel. So when you start going through Persian history, you're going to see a lot of Cyruses and a lot of Dariuses. Cyrus the Great is the one that we most talk about, and he's the one that came in contact with Daniel. Daniel 6:1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. Now, a satrap is just an appointed person that he trusts, and he is appointing officials to rule in his stead in these provinces around, so he doesn't have to have it all. He has somebody to go after if he has a question or something to do. He'll go to the person that's over that area. And over these, he had 3 governors. So he took these 120 and made smaller groups and put a governor over those people. Daniel was one of the governors, that the satraps might have account to them, so the king would suffer no loss. So he's got people watching out for his welfare, and he's got a governor with 40 or 50 or 60 satraps over each one, you know. Then Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So here's Darius saying, you know, I like this Daniel guy, and I might just do away with all this other stuff and make him over everything. That way I can go fishing. I can do what I want to do, and he's going to take care of it. I trust him completely. He seems like a trustworthy guy. He probably heard from other people that he was a trustworthy guy because he was over Babylon for years and years. So now he's taken over Babylon, and he's hearing from people, and he's watching Daniel, and he says, I might just give the whole thing to him and let him answer to me. Darius was 62 years old, and this wasn't his first rodeo. He knew exactly how to form a government to make his life easier and take care of business for the Emperor Cyrus. You'll find a person in leadership, if you've been in leadership very long, he understands what needs to be done. And he's not dreaming up new plans and things like this. So he is looking for trustworthy people to put a point over certain things to take care of his business for him. He just needed men he could count on, and Daniel was one of them. He recognized a good spirit was in Daniel and thought about even raising him up to manage the whole realm. The same thing happened to Joseph in Potiphar's house, the prison, and finally as the co-regent of Egypt. If we go back to our teaching in Egypt, in Exodus, we'll see that the same thing happened to Joseph. Everything he touched, he was made the head of. So even when he was in prison, he was like the head prisoner. Everybody went to him to get things done. So then when he finally got promoted to co-regent of Egypt, everybody went to him, and the Pharaoh just allowed Joseph to handle all the business. Okay? Men of God stand out when dealing with the rest of the world. The rest of the world is looking for cheats and liars and backstabbers, and they see a good person and they glom onto them because they know they can trust them. The world doesn't know how to handle a good person, but they know that they're valuable, so they hang on to them. We need to check ourselves to see if anyone else might know there's something different about ourselves. Do we have this aura of trustworthiness? Do we have an aura about us of not being a liar or a cheat? We need to stand out to people, and they will find leadership positions for you if you stand out. Character is what we show when no one is looking. A leader knows that character is something you can't buy or sell. Trust is always a valuable commodity, and you'll always be in demand if you can be trusted. So if you're looking at your job or whatever, the person is always going to be looking for somebody he can trust, and you'll get the good jobs, and you'll be over other people, and you're the one that's going to have to filter out the people that'll lie, cheat, and steal, and deal with them for the boss. Daniel 6:4. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they couldn't find a charge or a fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. So now you've got the Persians took over the Babylonians, and now you've got a Babylonian running everything. And so they're looking and saying, he ought to be answering to us instead of us answering to him. So now they're plotting against him. Here we are in the 4th verse, and they're already plotting to take over Daniel and knock him out. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So it didn't take them very long to figure out, we're not going to find anything wrong with this guy because he does everything right. So, but one thing we notice is he follows his God. And so we might be able to trip him up there because he will answer to God before he answers to the king. So they look at dividing the king and Daniel between his God. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius live forever. Verse 7, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and the satraps, the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So there's probably 3 or 4 or half a dozen of them probably have plotted together and come together and said, look, we can trip him up if we can get him to worship his God instead of the king. Because we're going to pass a law that says everybody that prays to the God, their God, will have to give it up and let the king do the praying for 30 days or they'll be thrown into a lion's den. So they're already plotting because they know he's going to pray 3 times a day every day. They've watched him long enough for that. Now these men have lied right off the get-go. They haven't got with all the satraps and all the other people. This is probably 6 or 8 or half a dozen people trying to trip up Daniel. Now another thing about laws in the Persian kingdom is once a Persian king signs a law, it can't be changed. And we get this also in the book of Esther. The king there wanted to divorce his wife, so they got him to divorce his wife, and he couldn't back out of divorcing his wife. His wife was never allowed to come before the king again because he signed this law. So once the king signs a law saying that for 30 days, everyone that wants to pray to their God has to come to the king, and the king has to do the praying for them, because the king is usually the God, you know, in these pagan religions. So they're plotting to get this done, and they know that no matter how much he likes Daniel, he has to stay with the law. He can't change the law. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they're telling you that the law will never change once he passes it. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. So he was tricked into this, not knowing that they're going to go after his best friend, Daniel, who he liked, and he was willing to make him head guy over the whole kingdom. There was 120 satraps run by 3 governors, and Daniel was one of the governors. In verse 3, the king had been overheard thinking about just putting Daniel over everything and going fishing. All of these Persians had just defeated Babylon, and Daniel was a Babylonian. And worse yet, he was a Jew. They figured Daniel should be taking orders from them, not the other way around. So they met together to plot against Daniel, but he was so pure, they couldn't find anything to trap him with. They did know Daniel well enough to know that he wouldn't break any of his God's laws, however. So they devised a plan to catch Daniel and get rid of him. They went to Darius and proposed to him that no one could pray to anyone but him for 30 days, or they would be cast to the lions. When Darius signed the law, they all knew that no one could change the law once it was signed. Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home in his upper room. With his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was the custom since the early days. So he knew what they were doing, but he wasn't going to fight it, so he went and left his windows open and prayed to God 3 times a day. And they knew that he would pray to God 3 times a day. They knew that all of the Jews would pray 3 times a day, but they were after Daniel. See? So it doesn't matter who the Jew was that they were watching, they're all going to pray to God unless they have gone against God, because that's just the way they did. Verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Verse 12. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said that this thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they just came up there, didn't you say that you're going to throw somebody in the lion's den if they didn't follow this law? And he said, this is true. He didn't know it was going to go against Daniel. Verse 13. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So they're just telling on him. The Persians knew that this decree would be easy for Persians, but very difficult for the Jews, as they had one God and prayed multiple times a day for everything. Besides, they would be watching for Daniel to pray and the others not so much. In other words, they were only watching Daniel because that's who they wanted to kill. This presented a problem that happens to every believer every day. Do you follow God's law or man's law? The longer we go down the road of secularism, the world designs laws that Christians cannot swallow. The world is naturally weeding out the wheat from the chaff, and more of us are turning into chaff. They knew Daniel would break man's law in one day. Think about where America would be if we followed God's laws. They also knew that the king couldn't change the law no matter how much he liked Daniel, due to their custom of irrevocable law. Another example of this is found in Esther 1. Esther 1 verse 19. If it pleases the king, let the royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So he's getting rid of his wife just by signing a law. She can't even come into the castle anymore. She's done. The Persian king just wrote a decree that the queen will never go before the king again, and it cannot be revoked. The men caught Daniel praying just as they predicted and brought him before the king. After that, they reminded him that he signed a decree that cannot be changed, and the king knew he had been tricked. Verse 14. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. I mean, a king is pretty smart. They get around pretty good. That's why they're king. And they have advisors and everything else, but he knew he'd been tricked. And he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. So he was looking for any legal avenue that he could reverse the sentence and not have to kill him. Now he's king. Why couldn't he just say, well, you guys tricked me and I'm not going to do that? But he was more or less bound by tradition, because they are not allowed to change the law, and they couldn't come up with any reason to change the law. So he was tricked, and he was going to kill the best guy in the kingdom because he couldn't change his mind. Now that locks in people that should have the authority and power to do the right thing. And he should have killed them, or arrested them, or whatever, and spared Daniel. Verse 15. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establisheth may be changed. So they're reminding him now, just kind of grinding it in. And like I said, he's a king. Why didn't he just do the right thing? But how many people are locked into traditions that they won't change, and they're doing what they're expected to do rather than take leadership? So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. So he is showing more confidence in Daniel than anybody else. He's saying, your God will deliver you from this. The king was mad at himself that he had allowed himself to be tricked about his best friend. Reminding him that he couldn't revoke his decree, I'm sure made him hate the satraps even more. He knew that he had no choice, so he put Daniel in the lion's den. Then he encouraged Daniel that his God would deliver him. Notice he said his God, so it's not his God. I don't ever understand why somebody loved Jehovah but never wanted to make Jehovah their God. They're still going to go worship Baal. But that's the way the pagans did. But they would allow Jehovah to be one of the gods, and they would say, good for him, that's a good God, and be impressed by his supernatural ability. But they would still go to Baal and worship him, even though Baal hadn't done anything for them, you know. Verse 17, then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So they went through the whole ritual of putting the stone up there and sealing it with wax and putting the signet ring in it. They all put their signet rings in it to make it all official, that this has to happen. It cannot be changed. It's all sealed and done per the king. So they want to make it official. Verse 18. So the king went to the palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Have you ever spent the night praying and fasting and really getting something, showing God that this is what you really want? This is not just some idle prayer. This is putting effort into something to show God that you mean business. 6:19. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. The king sealed the stone over the den, and then the others sealed it with their rings, so no one would be able to change the decree. It hurts Darius deeply to see what he had done to his friend. He spent his night fasting instead of sleeping. Have you ever wanted something so bad you fasted and prayed to show God how important your request was? I remember Gail had what I thought was heart trouble. It was very serious. And I made up my mind to fast and pray until she got a good report. And sure enough, when the report came back, it was good, and I stopped my fast. But I did fast the whole time, didn't eat anything, for 4 days. I think it was 4 days.
I didn't even know it.
Yeah. And it was something I felt I had to do. I think God wanted me to show that, do you really want this? Then you need to show me. And I just felt like that I needed to fast and pray and make sure that what had every symptom of heart trouble was nothing. It came back a good report. And I was so nervous that she was going to have a bad report that I fasted and prayed for 4 days.
Passed out.
So fasting and prayer does signal to God that this is important to you.
Yes.
Whenever we read in Scripture that somebody arises early in the morning, you'll find that it is spiritually very important and spiritually significant to Scripture. See, he got up early in the morning because he wanted to see what happened to his friend. But whenever you read in Scripture that somebody got up early in the morning, it's important spiritually. See, he could say, well, what good is it going to do me to go see a lion's den full of blood and guts in it, you know, that my friend's eating up? But he was actually looking forward to his friend still being alive. Abraham was going to go to Mount Moriah to sacrifice Isaac in Genesis, and it is written that he rose early in the morning. Wouldn't you drag your feet if your instruction was to sacrifice your child? I would have been up all night worrying and fretting over my child, and I would have dragged my feet as long as I could have to keep from going to sacrifice my child. But it says in the Scripture he rose early in the morning to get it done. He wanted to get it over with. It said that Jesus went to the cross for the joy set before him. He never fussed about anything. He was quiet the whole time. He was asked, is there anything you have to say? He didn't say anything. He went to the slaughter like a lamb, you know. because he knew that this was what he had to do. This is what he was supposed to do. After praying and fasting all night and predicting Daniel's God would save him, imagine how he felt when Darius heard Daniel's voice in the morning. Daniel 6:20. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continuously been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. So you can imagine him hearing this coming on the other side of the rock that's blocking the den. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. We need to talk about that a minute. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Well, obviously he broke the law because he signed the law and he didn't bring his petitions to Darius the king to carry to God. But the most important thing, I was found innocent before God. So God took care of him. Now, that doesn't mean that we're always going to live to everything, but you're innocent before God. They murdered you. You're not, he wasn't killed. If the lions had eaten him, he wouldn't have been killed because he was bad to God, because he was faithful to God. But God found no fault in him because he followed the laws of God and not man. And then he said, I didn't hurt you any either, because why would it be so important for me to bring my petitions to you to pray? So he was found innocent, is basically what he's saying. Then the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take up Daniel out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. The king wanted Daniel to be alive so bad in the morning that he cried out to Daniel as he arrived. Daniel immediately gave glory to God for his life being spared because he believed in God. It seems like almost every lesson I give now that I have to explain what Paul said in Romans 13, I might as well cover it now. And every lesson I give, when man's law and God's law come head to head, somebody is going to come up and read Romans 13 to you and say, you have to submit to the authorities of men. And it's going to say right here, Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment upon themselves. Now, this is not talking about breaking God's laws. This is talking about breaking man's laws. So he is basically saying that God put this man in authority over you, so you must follow what he says. Well, what if he says that sodomy is legal? What if he says that abortion is legal?
He's breaking God's law.
Exactly. So almost every Christian group you stand before, when this subject comes up, they're going to quote this verse and start saying, well, you have to follow man's law or you're bucking God. You know, you're just going against God because he appointed the man over you. Many Christians will use these verses to make others feel guilty by causing discord amongst the brethren when Satan passes a law that is an abomination to God. Culture is right in the middle of this right now, with things like abortion, sodomy, fornication, and more, that will test a Christian. It seems more and more of us are being peeled away because a loved one got pregnant with no husband. You know, if you have a daughter or a cousin or whatever who doesn't have a husband and she's pregnant, they're going to say, well, we can have an abortion because she doesn't deserve it. She's such a nice kid and everything. It doesn't matter that we believe that God creates the child. And it's not the child's fault. Why should the child die because of her sin? Or somebody meets a sodomite that is a friendly to them and they can't be that bad. You find all kinds of people. Well, I know a guy and he's a homosexual and he treats me good and he's a fine man and there's nothing wrong with him. He just likes men. Well, we can't take that into consideration because it's an abomination to God.
All right.
I don't think we should beat him up or anything, but you can't accept that what he is doing is right just because he's friendly
Yeah.
and everything. Reading God's word doesn't seem that vague when we read it. It seems pretty plain to us. But in the times seems to get more fuzzy in real life over time. So we can talk ourselves into a lot of stuff, but that doesn't mean that God's law has changed any. So God's law is still God's law. And if they choose, that's their business. But we have to choose God's law. And now we have the government that takes up for abortion. It says it's a woman's right to choose. And sodomy is saying, well, we believe that everyone should be able to love one another. Well, we don't believe that it's love. We believe it's lust. And it has nothing to do with loving one another. And God's way is one woman and one man in marriage. And that doesn't mean living together. I've run across that before. Charlie, we want to come to your house for Thanksgiving. Well, your girlfriend and you are not married. So are you willing to sleep in different rooms? Well, we sleep together now in our apartment every night. Not in my house, you don't. And that just blows their mind. They don't get what I'm getting at.
Right.
Because she's no longer a virgin. He's no longer a virgin. They don't care if anybody knows that they're committing fornication every night. So I'm supposed to bring fornication into my home. And I'm supposed to like it. Well, if I'm going to be a God-fearing man, I should say something about it and say, if you sleeping on the couch and she sleeps somewhere else, fine. But you're not sleeping together in my house. Okay? And also it kind of gives them a little prick and lets them know, I didn't think anybody even thought about that anymore. Maybe we should get married. Maybe since I've had 2 kids with this woman and I'm not married to her, maybe I should make them honest kids and be a father to them. You know? What if they said, should we get married? And they said, no, I don't want to get married. Well, you got 2 kids with that woman. You know? They're going to grow up without a father. Well, I'll play the father until we get ready to break up. They're more or less saying, one of these days I'm going to split because I don't want to marry her. Well, why are you still sleeping together? Why are you still having children together? You know, we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. And everybody is kind of smoothing it over and fogging it up, and it's not black and white to them anymore. We must always acknowledge our allegiance to God and don't allow the world to start convincing us that our allegiance must submit or even be shared with the world. We shouldn't even share the world's convictions. We have our convictions to God, and that's it. The apostles showed the proper reaction to this when they were commanded to stop preaching Jesus or go to jail. And they went to jail. Otherwise, the apostles were perfect citizens of Rome. They did everything the Romans told them to do, but they came up and said, you will not preach Jesus anymore. So they went out and preached Jesus, and they went to jail. And they ended up dying for their cause. Every single one of them died a horrible death except for John. Whole denominations have now accepted man's law over God's laws to have a smoother life and less trouble. Soon the world will turn in Christians to the law and punishment, thinking they're doing God's will. You're going to have people that are probably going to church and they're going to say, these fanatic crazy people are in my neighborhood and something needs to be done about them. They don't believe in sodomy. And they're making fun of this man that lives with a man over here or something. You know, we're not even allowed to quote verses from the Bible. Or we're picking on people.
Right.
And heaven forbid that we ever said anything against a woman having a baby out of wedlock. That's mean.
Teaching our children.
Yeah. I can even keep my mouth shut and just teach my children the ways of God, and they'll say that we're brainwashing them and being mean to the kids, and they'll never fit into the world. I don't want them to fit into the world, you see. Right. So this is what's going on here. We always bend to the world and let God's law slide by. We can see here that Darius could have said he made a mistake and canceled the decree and put Daniel in charge after seeing the caliber of people that wanted to kill his friend, and then put them in jail. But everyone seems to bow to the law, no matter how misplaced it is, except, of course, God's law. They always are willing to pass on that. Jesus should have cleared this conundrum up for most Christians in Mark 12. Mark 12, verse 14. When they had come, they said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men. So he is saying, look, we know that you're all about the law, and you don't give any regards to the highest person or the lowest person. You tell the truth, whatever it is. So we trust you in this matter. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? That was burning a hole in their pocket. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And they wanted to see what he said. Shall we pay or shall we not pay? But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius that I may see it. So they brought it to him, and he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And Jesus answered and said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. And they marveled at him, because they had never thought of that. You know, they thought that whatever the law was, you had to follow it. Well, he is saying, well, if it's God's law, you follow God's law. You render to God what is God's. But if God didn't cover it, then you follow man's law to be a good citizen. So when we're talking about taxes and other moral things like that, if God didn't say anything about it, then we have to follow man's law. But there's so much today that is against God's law, we have to follow God's law, and we're going to rub up against the world as it is now. And the more social things that we see, the moral things, God has a stance on it that we're to be moral people, and they're going to say, no, you can't be moral. You're going to have to follow what we say. I was just watching a man being drugged down the street in Canada because he was holding church when he was not supposed to be holding church. And so he had it anyway, and they came up and arrested him and drug him down the street to arrest him. And they were saying things like, he preaches against homosexuality and he preaches against abortion. And now he's breaking the law that in Canada because they had a meeting without the prior consent of the mayor or whatever. So he even called him and said, you're a bunch of Nazis. He came from Poland. He said, I remember in Poland when they did this, you know. So they're going to make us bend or else. They're going to increasingly focus in on the Christians until they get all the power and say, well, he's against homosexuality and he's against abortion and he is going to break the COVID law because you said don't have church and he's having church. Now, the bar can be open and the striptease people can be open, but church can't be open, see? So this is how they're doing it, by man's law instead of God's law. And we have ungodly people in charge because they can't recognize it.
Right.
And one of the things that I've seen lately is they want a virus passport, vaccine passport. What we're going to find in the end times is you will take my mark or you can't buy and sell. Now, I'm not saying that the vaccine passport is the same thing, but it operates on the same principle.
Step to it.
It operates on the same principle that you will do exactly what I say and you will follow me.
Yep.
And they're going to say, I'm God, because the Antichrist is going to claim to be God. You will follow me or you can't buy and sell. You don't have freedom to even live anymore. So whatever, you can see the principle involved. You will do as I say or you're going to be shunned and not be able to operate. And they're going to tell us you can't go into a restaurant, you can't get on an airplane, you can't get on a cruise boat, you can't go wherever you want to go, you can't go to a movie unless you have this vaccine
You
passport.
can't pay your taxes.
Yeah. So When we finally get to the last straw, he is going to say, you will take my mark, or you're not going to be able to buy and sell. Anyone who doesn't have the mark is against him, and he's going to come after you. And you can't take the mark as a Christian, because it's
Certain death.
certain death. It won't be following God. So he'll say, well, I'll tell you certain death. If you don't take the mark, I'm going to kill you. So you're going to die anyway. You know?
Yeah.
They won't.
I never saw stupidity on the level that I've seen in the last year, because kids don't catch this, and yet they're going to have to take the shot and go to school just to be able to go to school. And I'm like, my kid I'd homeschool. I would not let them take the shot. You got almost a 0.001 chance of dying if you're like 9 years old, or less than 15 years old. You got a less than 1% chance of dying of this disease. And we don't know what the vaccine is going to do to you. Well, I believe that a person's freedom should be able to say no. But he's going to say, then I'm free to not hire you,
Exactly.
because you're not coming into my
So,
place of business.
and
Do you
this-
think we're not going to have this problem again? There's going to be some problem come up. It doesn't necessarily have to be a plague.
Oh, yeah.
But some problem is going to come up and say, you must do this or else.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. We don't need to know what it might be. The problem I see is we're not even talking about it, discussing it beforehand,
No.
so that people will analyze. They think we're stupid.
See,
They say, just take the shot and go on about your business. You render to Caesar what belongs to him, but God is our king, and we must give him what is due him. We always got to remember that Jesus is our king, and he outrules everybody, okay? When you keep your priorities straight, you'll be fine. The problems are coming though, and someday an authority figure will say he is God, and you must take the mark or you can't eat and live. There will be many in that day that will dump God like a hot potato and take the mark gladly, just to see, just like these same people have accepted abortion and sodomy and are deciding to allow men into women's bathrooms and think it's all normal, and you are an old-fashioned fundamentalist extremist. In Canada today, a minister isn't allowed to even read some Bible passages because sodomy is the law of the land. How long do you think America will be able to carve out certain exceptions before pastors go to jail? America is quickly calling evil good and good evil. Holding another's view is becoming a crime because the First Amendment has been blown up for years now. Biblical prophecy tells us the choices will get more stark the closer we get until the last days, and we will all have to make tough decisions. These decisions are coming whether you think about it or not.
Right.
There's all kinds of people say, I don't want to talk about these things. It depresses me. Well, it's coming whether you think about it or not. Darius could resist the political pressure and carried out all the sentences even though he was king, and could have killed all that wouldn't follow his orders. Daniel knew it was a trap for him, yet he stayed true to God until death. See, he wasn't worried about the trap that they had set for him. He already knew and set his mind on, I'm going to do what God wants me to do. Notice what Daniel said when answering the king that he was all right. He told him that God had found him innocent. He was absolutely guilty of breaking the king's law, but God judges differently than men. You won't have any guilt to God if you break the laws of men. An immoral law is not a law at all to God. So they can make any law they want to and say you're guilty of breaking all these laws. Well, if it's not a law to God, it doesn't count. God has found you innocent, even though you might go to the gallows for man's law. God used this situation for his own glory, but for many of the first believers, there was no supernatural intervention. I found this to be quite stirring, that I'm glad that this story is in Daniel and shows God's supernatural intervention in his life. But there was a lot of people that were fed to the lions, were burned at the stake,
Yes.
were beheaded and killed. There's even being killed today,
Yes.
and it would be lovely to have supernatural intervention, but they're not getting it. So we need to always keep in mind that your decision to follow God is to follow God, not to get saved. Because if God saves you, glory, hallelujah. But he may not. God used this situation for his own glory, but for many of the first believers, there was no supernatural intervention. Many were fed to the lions, some were burned at the stake, and many were beheaded. The name Roman candle comes from the first century believers being tied up and hung on a wall to burn to light the Roman streets at night. They would bind them all up and set them on fire and let them burn on the streets. And it would provide light so the drunks could stagger home for their pagan homes by the light of a Christian that's burning all night. Daniel 6:24. And the king gave the command that they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all of the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. He said the God of Daniel. He didn't say my God. So
It's not accepting them.
right, he's still saying, man, this God of Daniel is something else.
Just like Nebuchadnezzar did.
Yeah, but I'm not going to follow him, you know. Okay. For he is the living God, and the steadfast forever. His kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure till the end. So he's making confession with all his mouth, but he's not making Jehovah his God. Verse 27, he delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now the king gets to enact his justice on a bunch of liars that lied in the capital case of Daniel. This was a life and death case. So they lied and tricked him. So he is enacting justice on a capital case, which is death for them. If Daniel could have died, then they're risking their life and had to die. For if you bear false witness in a capital case, you are guilty of murder, for which the penalty is death. As far as the women and children, we have to go back to Joshua 7 and the penalty of Achan that stole accursed things from Jericho. Him and his whole family with the livestock were killed and burned, and stones were piled on them. In this case, the bloodlines of these people were stopped and forgotten to history. So he felt that he needed to kill the women and children, even, of this family, so that there would be no offspring to come into his kingdom. Giving our lives over to Christ comes with a personal cost. We seem to believe that we will live a life of grace here on earth, but grace is about spiritual and eternal matters. What does it mean to pick up your crosses daily and follow Jesus? A cross is an execution stake. It means we should be willing to die to follow Jesus. And Jesus said, you must pick up your cross and follow me daily. So it's not without risk. It doesn't mean you have to die for Christ, but it means that you must be willing to die for Christ. He died for you. Why are you exempt from dying for him? Most of us think that we shouldn't even be inconvenienced to serve God, let alone going to jail or even death. In the last days, Daniel's predicament will be repeated daily over and over, and we must respond in the proper way. Just like I was talking about that Canadian preacher. He was willing to go to jail to prove a point. And how many Christian preachers would be proud to say they went to jail for Jesus? You know, most of them say, well, I don't have any convictions, you know. Darius did the same thing Nebuchadnezzar did when God proved himself to them. He made a decree for everyone to read that glorified the God of Daniel. But he just added Jehovah to his list of gods that he had his respect. Every apostle followed Jesus unto their own death, except John, who spent his life in prison and was released to take care of Mary and die naturally in Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. So the only one that stayed alive until the natural death was John. And he was assigned to take care of Jesus' mother, Mary. So they both died in Ephesus. And but all of the others died a horrible death. I mean, they were skinned alive and
Crucified
upside down and cut into pieces and spread all over. And there's a book called Lives of the Martyrs, and they explain a lot of it's not provable, but it's done by oral history what happened to them and what country they died in. They were in India and all over. They went to all kinds of countries, and they finally ended up dying because they pressed too many buttons, and they said, "You shut up, I don't want to hear any more." And they said, "Well, I have to tell you about Jesus." And they said, "Well, you'll do it at your own death." And they killed them. So we don't tend to think about things like that. We always look at the brighter side of things. And I remember a person telling me, well, if I get saved, my life will be peaches and cream, you know. I'm like, no, it'll probably be worse than it's ever been. And they didn't understand what I was talking about. I said, this is not about making your life easy. It's about preaching the truth. It's not discussed much today, but many converts seem to believe life on earth will be easy as a Christian. Jesus made it plain that we must always be ready to die for him if need be. We can see that secular America is becoming more and more difficult to separate God's laws from human laws. We see that pastors were required to close churches, increasingly required to misquote verses or stop reading them altogether. Many have been convinced that Jesus would approve of sodomy and abortion. The last days will be marked with a demand that we declare a man as God. Does it really matter that you declare sodomy good or declare abortion as a kind act for a woman or a man as God? It's virtually the same thing to God and breaks his laws. So there's no difference between saying abortion is okay and declaring yourself as God, because you're declaring what you think is good and going against his laws. Okay? Next time, Daniel has a vision of the four beasts that tells the future of the Gentile world.